That's it. I'm leaving, I announced, the door slamming behind me with a sharp thud. Fine, and don't bother coming back. My wife shot back without missing a beat. Normally, I'd toss out a go to hell or something equally cutting as I stormed out, but this time, I tried for a more dignified exit. 14 years of marriage had taught us both how to sling sharp barbs, but this time, I wasn't planning on returning in a few days to patch things up. No, this time, she'd understand what I meant soon enough. Over the past 6 months or so, Camila, my wife, had turned into a verbal wrecking ball. I couldn't figure out what had changed. Her constant jabs hit hard, and that's putting it mildly. To keep the peace, I started avoiding her altogether. Every day, I'd sit a little longer in my car after work, sometimes slipping back home after Camila and our 13-year-old daughter, Sophia, had already finished dinner. I told myself I needed space, but really, I was just dodging the tension. On good days, I'd find some leftovers in the fridge, but lately, even those had mysteriously disappeared before I got home. By the way, the name's Lucas Almeida. Well, technically, it's Rodrigo Lucas Almeida. But my dad's also a Rodrigo, so they went with Lucas from the start to avoid confusion. No, I'm not a junior. Dad's Rodrigo João Almeida, and for some reason, they skipped the junior thing altogether. I'd have been fine with junior or even DJ, but nope, just Lucas. If you're wondering, yes, I'm Brazilian, or, more accurately, an American with Brazilian roots. I've heard all the Brazilian jokes over the years. Most of them anyway. They seem to come up with fresh ones every year. Around here, in a town of 10 million people, my dad and I are the only Brazilians I know. That makes me the go-to punchline. Technically, I'm only half Brazilian. Mom's side is a mix of German, French, Irish, and English. But since I'm an Almeida, the Brazilian part is what sticks. As for Camila, my soon-to-be ex-wife, she wasn't who I thought she was. I only started piecing that together about 4 weeks ago. Like I said, I'd been steering clear of her because of all the tension. One Monday evening, I decided to grab dinner alone and ended up at a diner. I slid into a booth, ready to order, when I overheard 2 guys talking in the booth behind me. So, how long you been with the Brazilian guy's wife? One of them asked. Since they tied the knot, the other guy said, chuckling. Heck, I even bet her on their wedding day. And he's still clueless. The first voice didn't ring any bells, but the second? That one hit me like a freight train. It was Gabriel Costa, my best friend. The same Gabriel who stood by me as my best man at the altar. I froze, trying to process what I was hearing. They kept talking, but I couldn't focus until Gabriel said, yeah, we rendezvous at least twice a month. Lucas is so clueless, he doesn't have a clue. Right then, the waitress came to take my order. I barely managed to, sorry, gotta go, before bolting out of there, making sure they didn't see me. My mind was spinning. Camila? With Gabriel? The guy who's not just my best friend, but also the only mechanic I trust. I own a used car dealership. Yeah, I've heard all the jokes about used car salesmen too, but I run an honest business. People trust me to sell them reliable cars at fair prices, and if anything goes wrong, I make it right. Gabriel has been my go-to guy for years, keeping all my cars in top shape. I even wanted to hire him full-time, but he joked he couldn't respect himself if he worked for a Brazilian. He laughed when he said it, but I had a feeling he wasn't entirely joking. So, I kept him as an independent contractor, even though I was his sole client. Driving aimlessly after leaving the diner, I tried to convince myself that Gabriel was just bragging. Maybe he was full of it. But I needed answers, so when I got home, I decided to check Camila's phone and email. Camila was her usual self that night, which made things easier. Once she fell asleep, I went through her stuff. Her email was clean, and while her phone was locked, it didn't take long to figure out the password, our daughter's birth date. I found a few questionable messages, but nothing from Gabriel. His name in her contacts wasn't surprising, considering he was my friend. Still, something didn't sit right. Camila's recent behavior was off, and even if it wasn't Gabriel, it felt like there was someone else. I went to bed restless and couldn't sleep until well past 2:30 a.m. The next morning at the dealership, Gabriel cracked one of his usual Brazilian jokes. Normally, I'd let it slide, but this time, I snapped. Gabriel, what do you even know about Brazil? I shot back. Bet you couldn't find it on a map if your life depended on it. You joke about Brazilians being dim, but I'm sure they could locate the U.S., maybe even our state. He stood there, speechless. For once, I had nothing else to say. Gabriel must have sensed I was onto him. He wasn't the academic type, more street smart than book smart. The kind of guy who could rebuild an engine blindfolded but never quite figured out how to navigate a textbook. Maybe that's why we clicked back in high school. I used to help him with his studies, making sure he passed his classes and graduated. Now, though, I was questioning what I'd seen in him all these years. Thinking about him got me reflecting on how I'd ended up with Camila, too. After mulling it over for a while, I retreated to my office, shut the door, and started planning how I could get the proof I needed. A direct confrontation with either of them wouldn't work. They'd just deny everything. I needed hard evidence. I called a private investigator in Santa Fe and laid it all out for him. He explained that trailing them would be expensive since their meetups seemed irregular. You could track her phone to at least know where she's been, he suggested. Or install cameras at home, but good ones are pricey. And even then, if she's paying attention, she might spot them. Honestly, your best bet is the phone tracker. It's discreet and effective. He gave me the name of a tracking app and even waived off payment for the advice. It's all stuff you can find online anyway, he said. I thanked him, saying he had been very helpful, and promised to send him a check. I added that if he ever found himself in Silver City, he should stop by Almeida's auto lot, my way of showing appreciation for his assistance. He smiled and replied that he didn't usually do that, but if there was a chance, he would stop by. That little exchange stuck with me. A lot of my success in sales comes from making people feel seen and valued. It's amazing what a bit of kindness can do. I decided to go with the tracker app. It was cheaper and less hassle than setting up cameras. That night, once everyone was asleep, I snuck into our bedroom, grabbed Camila's phone, and installed the app. It synced with mine in no time and ran quietly in the background, undetectable to her. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The next day at work, I checked the app periodically. Camila worked part-time at the university bookstore, 15 to 20 hours a week. She always called her earnings mad money and spent most of it on salon visits. That day, her tracker showed the usual, bookstore, grocery store, then back home. Gabriel's tracker would have told me more, but I had to work with what I had. He seemed to be at home most of the day, and whenever Camila was home, he was out. At least for that day, nothing seemed suspicious. That evening, I made an effort to be civil. I suggested we all go out for dinner. Camila seemed surprised but agreed. Sophia hesitated like any teenager, but eventually, I got her to come along. Dinner went well enough. At one point, I casually mentioned Gabriel's name, and Camila immediately looked uncomfortable, changing the subject as quickly as she could. It only added fuel to my suspicions. I resolved to get to the bottom of this. That night, I avoided checking her phone again. Figured I wouldn't find anything anyway. Climbing into bed, I said, "Thanks for coming to dinner tonight, Camila." She thanked me, her eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like weeks, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice as she said, "It was nice." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "You might be in luck tonight. It's been a while, hasn't it?" She disappeared into the bathroom to do her nightly routine, and I lay there, conflicted. If she'd been unfaithful, did I even want to be close to her? I decided not to initiate anything. If it happened, it would be on her terms. We did end up getting close that night, but it felt routine, almost mechanical. No need for details, but let's just say it didn't clear any of my doubts. Throughout the week, I kept tabs on her location. Nothing out of the ordinary came up. By Saturday night, I was almost convinced Gabriel had been blowing smoke, trying to impress someone with his wild tales of conquest. Wouldn't be the first time. He'd always been like that, even back in school. But as much as I tried to brush it off, my gut wouldn't let me rest. At 2 a.m., I was still tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't sleep. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts were too loud to let me drift off. Finally, I gave up and went downstairs, figuring a drink might calm my nerves. I poured myself a Jack and Coke, then grabbed Camila's phone from the counter. Sitting on the couch with the glass in one hand and her phone in the other, I decided to check it again. The password was still Sophia's birth date. Unlocking the phone brought a wave of memories I hadn't thought about in years. Sophia's pregnancy was not easy. Camilla's RH factor did not match Sophia's, and her body rejected the baby. Those 9 months were like a roller coaster, especially the last 3 weeks when Camila was confined to bed rest. When Sophia was finally born, healthy, thank God, it was like a miracle. But Sophia was no easy baby. She cried constantly, rarely slept, and struggled to nurse. That first year was grueling, and by her second, Camila had declared, "No more kids." It stung to hear, but I couldn't blame her. Our lives had been drained of joy for so long. I remembered something else, too. Sophia was born exactly 9 months after our wedding. People used to call her a honeymoon baby, but if Gabriel's claims were true, then maybe Sophia had been conceived before that night. Camila had been on the pill back then, but stress can mess with hormones, right? Could the wedding chaos have rendered the pills useless? And if they didn't work that night, what about earlier? A thought struck me like lightning. There was a chance, a 50-50 chance, that Sophia wasn't mine. I stood up, leaving my drink behind, and went to the bathroom. I grabbed a cotton swab and headed to Sophia's room. She was sound asleep, her little mouth open as she snored softly. It was easy to gently swab the inside of her cheek without waking her. I sealed the swab in a plastic bag and did the same for myself. Even if Sophia turned out to be my biological daughter, there were still questions. But I pushed those thoughts aside for now, one step at a time. The next day was Sunday, and we all had our usual chores. I made an effort to avoid Camila and Sophia as much as possible, needing space to process everything. I was anxious, but I couldn't let it show. At one point, Camila mentioned, almost as if she had read my mind, that I seemed distracted. Thinking quickly, I replied, "I'm planning to buy a bunch of cars at the next auction. Stocking up for the lot might tighten cash flow for a bit." She advised me not to overextend, always treating the dealership like it was ours, even though I knew deep down it was really mine. "Don't worry. I'm thinking of paying off some credit cards and keeping just one open to improve our credit," I added. It wasn't entirely true. It was mostly to cover my tracks if she noticed anything unusual. She said indifferently that I should do whatever I thought was best. An idea clicked into place. If things went south, I'd need to protect myself financially. Monday morning, I took the swabs to the biology department at Western New Mexico University. The department head was intrigued by the request and happy to help. I handed him some business cards. I offered that if anyone needed a good car, they could let me know, and I'd give them a 10% discount. He smiled, mentioning he'd been thinking about replacing his Camry and might drop by soon. I nodded and replied that sounded good. As I left, I couldn't shake the worry creeping into my gut. The test results could change everything. Back at work, I called in Paul, my accountant, and shared my plans to buy new cars. Then, on impulse, I added, "I'm also thinking about paying off my mortgage with a lump sum. Can we make that happen?" He told me he'd crunch the numbers and get back to me after lunch. When he left, I considered calling a lawyer to discuss family law, but I held back. One step at a time. Let's see the test results first, I told myself. The next 2 days crawled by. By Wednesday evening, I was a wreck, but finally, the call came. The department head confirmed the results and stopped by my office to deliver them in person. His face said it all before he even spoke. "The samples aren't related," he said gently. I nodded, the news hitting harder than I'd expected, even though I'd been bracing for it. He handed me the envelope, and I stared at it for a moment before setting it aside. Forcing a smile, I looked up and brought up the car he mentioned. He chuckled and said that, now that he'd hit the big 5-0, he was thinking about a sports car, maybe a Mazda Miata. I told him I didn't have one in stock, but I'd find one for him. The next day, I reassured the department head that I'd scout for a well-kept Mazda Miata at the auction and update him that afternoon. Before heading out, I told Judy, my assistant, that I might leave early but would be reachable if needed. Not that she ever really needed me. She handled most of the business seamlessly. Driving through the city that morning, everything felt off. It was as though my world had shifted, and nothing looked the same anymore. Pulling into a quiet parking lot, I made a call to my lawyer. Though he expressed sadness over my situation, He quickly referred me to a trusted family law colleague. By the end of the call, I had an appointment scheduled for that evening. Later, while sitting alone at a restaurant with a quick snack, the weight of the past 15 years bore down on me. Had I wasted all this time? The realization that Sophia wasn't biologically mine didn't erase my feelings for her, but it did change everything. Could I really continue this charade? One thing was clear. Gabriel would face consequences. He'd been my closest friend for years, but now, with friends like him, who needed enemies? And Camila, she wasn't escaping this unscathed either. Whether she knew Sophia wasn't mine or not, she'd hidden the truth of her betrayal for over a decade. Sleeping with my best man on our wedding day? That wasn't just infidelity, it was a complete mockery of our vows. My anger surged, building like a storm inside me. I knew I needed to get away, to clear my head before it boiled over. I called Camila to tell her I wouldn't be coming home. "Hello, Lucas," she answered. I told her, keeping my voice steady, that I would be staying the night in Albuquerque to prep for the auction the next day. She responded in a flat tone, just saying that she hoped I had a safe trip. I hung up and exhaled, wondering if she'd use my absence to her advantage. Would she slip away to meet Gabriel? If she did, she'd have to come up with a story for my parents if Sophia asked about her. Not that it mattered. I'd be keeping an eye on her phone tracker throughout the evening. The drive to Albuquerque was long and lonely, filled with thoughts of everything I'd learned. My plan was to purchase at least 20 cars at the auction, including the Miata for the department head. Afterward, I'd arrange for them to be picked up, inspected, and delivered to my lot. The problem was finding someone reliable to handle the inspections. Gabriel usually handled these for me, but I wasn't giving him another dollar once his current batch of repairs was done. I'd need to quietly find someone else, someone dependable and professional, without tipping Gabriel off. Knowing him, the moment he heard I'd bought 24 cars, he'd jack up his prices, expecting to cash in. Not this time. When I arrived in Albuquerque, it was just past 9. I checked into a Best Western. Nothing fancy. I couldn't justify spending company money on a luxury hotel. The room was simple but comfortable, with a bed that looked inviting after the long drive. Still, sleep didn't come easy. My mind raced with questions. How could Camila justify what she'd done? Betraying me on our wedding day, then continuing that betrayal for years. It was unimaginable. And yet, she'd carried on as though everything was fine. I started to rethink everything about our marriage. It had never been perfect, sure, but I'd believed in us. I'd believed in our love. Now, I realized it had been a mistake from the beginning. After Sophia's birth, things had been especially rocky. We hadn't planned on a baby right away. Our original plan was to wait a few years and have 3 children eventually. But Sophia's arrival changed everything. Camila had a difficult pregnancy, and Sophia had been a challenging baby. By the time she turned 2, Camila was adamant. There'd be no more children. Looking back now, knowing what I knew, it all felt so futile. If Camila hadn't been with Gabriel, would things have been different? If Sophia had been my child, would Camila have been happier? Would she have been willing to try for more kids? 14 years of effort, of sacrifices, all felt wasted. Every happy memory, every good time, was now tainted by the shadow of betrayal. Gabriel wrecked my life the day he seduced my future wife, on our wedding day, no less. Now, he hosts her at least twice a month, probably laughing at me behind my back. The fool who didn't see it coming. I couldn't let him get away with it. He had to face the consequences. As I lay there, staring at the hotel ceiling, anger bubbled up again. My thoughts spiraled, and I knew sleep wouldn't come unless I found a way to calm down. I flipped on the TV and landed on some goofy comedy show. It wasn't much, but the laughter eased the tension in my chest. By 11, my eyelids felt heavy. Tomorrow would be a busy day, and I needed the rest. The auction went smoothly. I snagged some great cars at solid prices and networked with dealers from the Albuquerque area. There were no Miatas at the auction itself, but I tracked down 2, one red, one black, through other dealers. I negotiated tentative deals, pending my client's preference, and both dealers were happy to work with me. Looking around, I realized I should attend these auctions more often. Connecting with fellow businessmen in the industry gave me ideas for expanding my operations. Plus, It was a welcome distraction from the mess at home. That afternoon, I had my appointment with the lawyer. The news wasn't encouraging. Divorce would mean losing half my assets, along with alimony and child support payments for a child who wasn't even mine. Sitting there, I made a decision. I wouldn't divorce Camila. Instead, I'd leave her with Gabriel's child. I'd pay off the mortgage on the house and let her live there, but with my name solely on the deed, she wouldn't be able to sell it. By covering the taxes and utilities while living elsewhere, I could make sure she'd have no option but to stay put. Still, I needed to protect my business. Even though it was registered as a corporation, I couldn't shake the feeling that it might still be vulnerable. Consulting my business lawyer became a top priority. By the time I got home, I was beyond exhausted. I muttered to myself that I was beat, planning to grab a shower and crash as I headed straight for the bedroom. She asked if I wanted dinner, almost as an afterthought. I told her no, that I'd had a late lunch. At least she cared enough to ask. The shower was a brief escape, a moment of peace as the hot water washed over me. For a few minutes, it felt like my worries were swirling down the drain. Once I hit the pillow, sleep came quickly, a rare gift after such a grueling week. The next morning, I woke up refreshed for the first time in days. I left early, slipping out before Camila or Sophia stirred. At the office, I dove into spreadsheets and reports, planning my next moves. I briefed Paul on the 23 car purchases and told Judy to stop assigning work to Gabriel. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press me. "You're the boss," she said with a shrug. "Thanks, Judy. You're a lifesaver," I replied, grateful for her reliability. At 9 sharp, I called my business lawyer for advice. He warned me that while my business was registered, she could still force a sale to claim half its value. He suggested I might want to consider selling preemptively. I told him I couldn't sell, my voice firm as I explained that the business was my life. He nodded and said he'd think it over, promising to get back to me by the end of the week. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd poured years of effort into building this business. It was like my child. Unlike Sophia, I thought bitterly, trying to push the resentment aside. I called Charlie about the Miata deal, knowing he was still interested. I told him that I had found 2 options, one red, one black, and asked if he was still interested in either. He replied that he'd consider it if the price was right, and then asked which color it was. I reassured him that I would show him both cars and we would work out the numbers. I then asked what his preference was. He explained that the red was bold but faded quickly, while the black was sleek but got hot. Then he asked if I was planning to garage it. I confirmed, and he immediately decided to choose red. After hanging up, I contacted the dealer with the red Miata to negotiate a trade. He was interested in a BMW I'd had sitting on my lot for months, one that'd sell better in a larger city like Albuquerque. Later, Gabriel showed up with cars still waiting on repairs. As much as I wanted to cut ties, his flexible schedule still suited my current needs. He casually asked when the auction cars were coming in, completely unaware of the seething resentment building up inside me. "Late next week, maybe early the following one," I said, managing a forced chuckle as he left. That weekend, I stayed out of Camila's way. Yard work, errands, anything to avoid her. I didn't bother checking her phone tracker anymore. My feelings for her had hardened into pure contempt. The thought of raising another man's child while she carried on her betrayal felt like the ultimate insult. Monday brought me back to the car show, ready to finalize the trade of the BMW for the Miata. The dealer suggested grabbing lunch when I arrived, so I made arrangements and headed out to Albuquerque. Before leaving, I informed Camila I'd be gone for most of the day and told Judy to handle things in my absence. She reassured me she had everything under control, her steady competence reminding me she deserved a raise. The drive was smooth, and the lunch meeting turned out to be a pleasant break from the usual stress. Spending time with another professional in the industry felt energizing. On the drive back in the fiery red Miata, with the wind whipping through my hair, I felt a rare sense of freedom. The little sports car was exhilarating. Inspired, I decided I might even treat myself to a black one later, realizing I didn't need anything bigger than a 2-seater for my next vehicle. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Camila glance out the window. She spoke briefly to Sophia, and both of them stepped outside. Camila's tone carried a hint of condescension as she questioned why I'd brought home such a small car, pointing out that we needed something with more space. I tried to keep my voice even as I explained it was for a client and offered her a chance to take a ride, but she declined, claiming she didn't like small cars. I turned to Sophia, hoping she'd be more excited. Instead, she crossed her arms and delivered a sharp comment about how she was already teased because of her last name. The jab stung. It wasn't just the words but the way she said them. So casually dismissive, so full of teenage contempt. I glanced at Camila, expecting some kind of reproach for Sophia's tone, but she didn't react. She didn't defend me, or even seem to think it was worth addressing. The realization hit me like a blow. They both held me in contempt. Without saying much, I climbed back into the Miata and drove off. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to clear my head. The small car zipped along the quiet streets of Silver City as I tried to process the growing fracture in my family. When I finally returned home late that evening, I headed straight upstairs to shower and decompress. By the time I crawled into bed, Camila came into the room, flipping on the light, catching me in the glare. I squinted, closing my eyes against the brightness as she began chastising me. She mocked me for being petty, even childish, over the car and accused me of sulking instead of spending time with them. Her tone was laced with disdain, as if she couldn't even muster basic respect anymore. I couldn't help but wonder if years of influence from Gabriel had twisted her perspective of me. Even Sophia seemed to mirror her attitude now. I'd had enough. Keeping my voice level, I pointed out the obvious. If they didn't want a Brazilian man in the house, they might as well leave. The silence that followed was tense, but I didn't care anymore. The warmth in our household had long since turned to ice, and I wasn't about to thaw it alone. The next day, I called Charlie to inspect the Miata. He loved it and was thrilled when we worked out a deal. While finishing up the paperwork, he mentioned an opportunity. His friend handled purchasing for a university fleet, rotating several cars every couple of years. Charlie promised to pass my details along. I thanked him, glad for the referral. Building and maintaining relationships like this was what kept my business thriving, even when everything else in my life felt like it was crumbling. By midweek, my lawyer called with an update. He had devised a plan to protect my assets, and I eagerly went to hear it. The strategy wasn't without risks, but it gave me direction. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly moved personal items and tools into a nearby apartment. Camila didn't notice. She was too absorbed in her routines. Sophia was the same, barely looking up from her phone most of the time. That Monday night, I told Camila I was leaving. Her response wasn't surprising. More insults, more contempt. In the past, I might have retreated to a motel for a night or two, but this time I knew it was permanent. By Tuesday morning, I was at the dealership early, gathering the team for our weekly meeting. I kept my tone casual, as if it were business as usual, but I had big news to share. The cars from the recent auction had arrived and were ready for sale. I let the team know that we wouldn't be working with Gabriel anymore. If he asked, they were to say we'd moved in a different direction. There was a moment of quiet as they processed the change, but no one questioned it. I looked around the room at the people who made up my team. They felt more like family than the people in my own home. Letting them down wasn't an option, no matter how much my personal life had unraveled. The air in the conference room felt heavy as I paused to steady myself. Brushing away a tear, I delivered the news. I had sold the business. The words hung in the air, and the team exchanged surprised glances. I quickly reassured them that little would change in their day-to-day roles, except for Judy. She'd take on some of my responsibilities and get a well-deserved raise for her dedication. Their initial shock shifted to congratulations, recognizing her hard work and capability. I asked her to stay behind after the meeting to discuss the transition. Addressing the group again, I told them I'd remain involved in an advisory capacity and might occasionally handle sales. This seemed to ease their concerns. After the meeting, as we filed out, Gabriel stood waiting outside. His expression was a mix of curiosity and annoyance. He wanted to know why he hadn't been included. I kept my tone calm and explained the meeting was for staff only. He wasn't an employee. That seemed to catch him off guard. He glanced at the lot and mentioned the cars, offering to get to work on them. I cut him off. The cars were already prepped for sale. His services were no longer needed. He protested, claiming he always checked the cars, but I stood firm. I told him I'd sold the business and that the new owner had decided to move in a different direction. His shock turned to indignation. He couldn't believe I'd sold the business and immediately made it about himself. Calmly, I informed him he could pick up his paycheck for the past 2 weeks of sporadic work. I made no effort to hide my disdain. I wanted to unload my anger right then, but I held back. Gabriel wasn't worth it. Later, in a private discussion with Judy, I laid out the details of my plan, swearing her to confidentiality. She assured me of her discretion. I explained that I'd set up 2 Nevada-registered companies, one to purchase the parking lot and the other to buy the business. I retained full ownership of both entities. The arrangement was designed to shield the business from Camila. I told Judy that I had moved out, though Camila didn't know yet. I wasn't going back. I told her that Camila had cheated on me with Gabriel and that Sophia wasn't my biological daughter. She most likely belonged to Gabriel. I wasn't sure if Camila knew or if Gabriel was even aware, but they'd find out soon enough. I explained my strategy to continue paying the house's utilities and taxes, ensuring she couldn't claim abandonment. Divorce was inevitable, but I intended to make sure Camila couldn't touch the business or its assets. By the time she initiated legal proceedings, the business funds would be long gone, legally spent or transferred. Judy listened carefully, her expression shifting to one of empathy and fierce loyalty when she heard about Camila and Gabriel. I admired her professionalism and trusted her completely. Before I left, I gave her one final task, to order a new sign and letterhead. The business was getting a new name, Helpless Cars. It was a cryptic choice, but I told her it was deliberate and would make sense one day. Though puzzled, she agreed without question. After saying my goodbyes, I left the lot and drove off in my Audi, heading toward Albuquerque. A couple of hours into the drive, my phone rang. The car's speaker picked up the call. It was Camila. Her voice sounded hesitant, almost cautious, as she asked what was going on. I kept my response flat, mentioning I was on my way to Albuquerque to pick up a car. She pressed further, bringing up something she'd heard. Gabriel, or maybe someone else, must have contacted her. She speculated about what was happening, even hinting that she had heard about the sale of the business. I confirmed it without emotion, brushing off her questions about why she hadn't been consulted. When she corrected herself, claiming it wasn't Gabriel but my best friend who had called her, I almost laughed. The idea of Gabriel as a best friend was a sick joke. He wasn't my friend. He was the man who had systematically disrespected me and wrecked my life. Camila's concerns seemed to revolve around our finances, likely fearing the implications of my decision. I ended the conversation by reminding her that this was my company. What I didn't say, what I wanted to scream, was that she had lost the right to share in anything I had built the moment she betrayed me. I reminded Camila that I owned the business before we got married and had every right to sell it whenever I saw fit. It was no longer my concern, but I did hope the new owner would treat the former employees well. Her voice trembled as she asked if I got a good price for it. I knew she was only worried about maintaining her standard of living, but I didn't care. I just needed a change. I told her I'd take some time off to relax before starting the job hunt. That's when she panicked about the mortgage. Calmly, I informed her that I had used the proceeds to pay off the house, so she only needed to handle utilities and taxes. But she kept going, nearly hysterical, rattling off concerns about food, gas, and insurance. Honestly, I hadn't given those much thought. I suggested she consider working more hours. Camila's voice was filled with desperation when she asked me when I was coming home. That was the moment of truth, and I gave it to her straight. I wasn't planning on coming back. I reminded her of her own words when I had walked out that night, how she had said she'd figure out the bills and make sure the power stayed on. Now, the same person who had exuded confidence was pleading with me to return, her voice thick with emotion. She insisted that I couldn't do this, that I needed to come back, but I felt no inclination to change my stance. I remained calm, letting her desperation roll off me. When she begged again, her words carried a note of finality, as if she hoped to break through my resolve. Then she tried her last tactic, mentioning Sophia. She asked what I planned to do about her. I couldn't help the sigh that escaped me as I responded internally, thinking of Sophia as the girl who had spent years embarrassed by her last name and ashamed of the fact that her father was, or had been, a used car salesman. Camila tried to rationalize Sophia's attitude, reminding me that she was only 13, too young for me to take her behavior to heart. But it was too late for that. None of it mattered anymore. My decision was made, and I wasn't coming back. If anything, my departure would spare all of them the embarrassment they seemed to feel when they looked at me. With that thought solidified, I ended the call and turned off my phone, leaving Camila to process everything on her own. As I drove toward Albuquerque, the weight of her words began to lift. The silence in the car was a relief. I figured Camila's next move would involve reaching out to Gabriel for information or to vent about me. It didn't bother me. I knew how predictable they both were. When I finally reached my destination, I powered my phone back on and saw 5 missed messages waiting for me. Camila had called 3 times, Gabriel once, and Judy had also left a message. I decided to return Judy's call first. When she answered, I explained that I had turned my phone off to avoid unwanted calls. She quickly reassured me that she understood. Apparently, Camila and Gabriel had already tried to involve her, asking questions and trying to piece together my whereabouts. Judy had handled it with her usual grace, telling them simply that I no longer owned the business and wouldn't be returning. Her reassurance eased my tension. She mentioned that if they persisted, she wouldn't hesitate to warn them about crossing boundaries. It was classic Judy, steadfast and no nonsense. She reminded me that, no matter what I might be feeling, I wasn't alone. She considered me family, and she always would. Her words hit me harder than I'd expected. It wasn't often that someone extended genuine kindness to me without an agenda. I thanked her sincerely, even joking about how fortunate her husband was to have someone like her. She laughed lightly, telling me he didn't take her for granted, not even for a second. I promised myself I wouldn't either, not her support or her wisdom. After the call, I decided not to bother with Camila or Gabriel. Let them figure things out on their own. I headed into the parking lot office to meet with the owner about trading the Audi. He admired its condition and said he could sell it within a week. When he asked if I was sure about the swap, I told him I wasn't looking to profit, just wanted a fun sports car. 30 minutes later, I was back on the road, top down, feeling the wind and freedom. I spent the next 3 months wandering the Southwest, covering over 8,000 miles. I checked in with Judy occasionally, making sure everything was running smoothly. Meanwhile, Camila and Gabriel kept calling. At first with annoyance, then apologies, and finally resentment. I shrugged it all off, especially Gabriel's laughable attempts to make me feel guilty. I drove through northern New Mexico, Arizona, southern Utah, and Colorado, then headed west to Reno, Lake Tahoe, Napa Valley, and Highway 1. From there, I zigzagged to San Diego, Death Valley, Vegas, and Phoenix, soaking in the open road. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Upon arriving back in Silver City, I made my way to Helpless Auto, where I was warmly greeted by the team. Familiar faces, along with a few new ones, welcomed me with enthusiasm, expressing their joy at my return. I stepped into what used to be my office, now occupied by Judy. When she looked up and saw me, her smile broadened, and she quickly stood, moving around her desk to give me a heartfelt hug. After some light conversation, I asked her if it would be possible to treat everyone to food and drinks at Wrangler's and suggested closing the shop early. It was already 3 p.m., and I wanted us all to meet there by 5. Judy immediately agreed, promising to arrange everything. Before leaving, I announced the plan to the team, who seemed thrilled about the idea, and left them in high spirits. Next, I headed to my lawyer's office. During my travels, he had kept me updated about Camila's attempts to claim abandonment in order to seize my assets. Thankfully, he had managed to block her efforts, and we spent some time discussing our next steps. By 5 p.m., I was at Wrangler's with the team. Dinner was excellent, and the opportunity to reconnect with everyone was just what I needed. As the evening wound down, the others gradually left, leaving Judy and me alone at the table. She looked at me thoughtfully, as if weighing her words, and told me I had misplaced my trust in those I cared about, but that it didn't make me weak or foolish. Her insight hit me hard, and I couldn't deny the truth in her words. She went on to say that while I may have lost something, it wasn't my identity. She acknowledged that the jokes and labels others had pinned on me over the years never defined who I truly was. Her words carried more weight than she likely realized, and I found myself thanking her, not just for her wisdom, but for the remarkable way she had handled the responsibilities I had left in her care. She hadn't tried to fill my shoes. She had carved her own path, and it was inspiring to witness. After a brief embrace, Judy departed to meet her husband, who looked genuinely content to see her. Later that night, I returned to my apartment. It had been 3 months since I'd last set foot there, and the stale air reminded me of just how long I'd been gone. I opened the windows to let in the evening breeze, grabbed a beer, and settled on the terrace overlooking the pool. Families were enjoying themselves below, and for a moment, I allowed myself to take it all in. But my thoughts inevitably drifted back to Camila and me. We had once shared dreams and built plans together, yet now, those aspirations felt like distant memories. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was time to face what I had been avoiding. I grabbed my keys, climbed into my Miata, and drove to the house that was still technically mine. It had been purchased before our marriage, and the deed carried only my name. Pulling into the driveway, I was met with disappointment. The yard was unkempt, the landscaping neglected, and the house's exterior seemed to reflect the disarray within. The porch light was on, signaling that Camila was likely home. Knocking on the door, I was greeted by Sophia, whose surprise was evident in her wide eyes. She greeted me hesitantly, calling out to her mother. Moments later, Camila appeared from the kitchen, her voice sharp and defensive as she spotted me. She barely had time to react when Gabriel emerged from the bedroom, clad in nothing but his underwear. The scene was almost absurd, but the betrayal it underscored wasn't lost on me. Camila and I exchanged heated words, with her trying to justify her actions and me countering each of her excuses. The tension escalated when I informed her that she and Gabriel would need to find another place to live. She bristled at my declaration, claiming the house was hers, but I reminded her that legally, it was still mine. The final blow came when I revealed what I had long suspected. Sophia wasn't my biological daughter. I stated it plainly, leaving no room for ambiguity. Camila's face went pale, and Gabriel, too, seemed shaken by the revelation. I made it clear that they needed to take responsibility and start fresh elsewhere. The room fell silent as the weight of the truth settled over them, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had regained some measure of control over my life. Camila and Gabriel nearly spoke in unison when they tried to dismiss my claims, but I was prepared. Without a word, I handed them the DNA report, inviting them to see the truth for themselves. They snatched it from my hand, quickly scanned the contents, and then froze as if the weight of the revelation had knocked the air out of them. I turned to Sophia and told her to inform her mother and Gabriel that Camila would be served divorce papers along with an eviction notice the following week. Then, without another glance, I walked away. Despite my resolve, I couldn't stop the flood of thoughts. Had this affair been going on throughout our marriage? Had Camila ever really chosen me? Or was I just a pawn in her game? The questions gnawed at me, leaving me feeling helpless, ignorant, and utterly betrayed. Gabriel, the man who had mocked me with cruel jokes to my face and behind my back, was now tangled in this mess. Back at my apartment, I tried to quiet my thoughts with beer, but the betrayal stayed with me, sharp and relentless. The next morning, I visited my lawyer to begin the divorce proceedings. I knew the house would have to be sold, with the proceeds split between us. Thankfully, since I wasn't earning much, there was little chance I'd owe alimony or child support, especially with another man stepping into my place. At least, that's what I hoped for. The betrayal from both Camila and Gabriel was a wound I wasn't sure how to heal. Rebuilding trust with anyone, whether a friend or a partner, seemed like an insurmountable task. Maybe therapy was the answer, but for now, I focused on keeping my head above water. As the legal battle began, I returned to the dealership. I made it clear to my colleagues that I was no longer the boss and only needed one sale a week to cover my expenses. When the court ordered child support, I emptied my accounts, leaving just enough to scrape by. At the end of the month, Camila had hired a lawyer, though I wondered how she could afford it. Maybe he was working pro bono, Or perhaps she had scraped together the funds. Either way, they were in for a surprise. I had nothing left for them to take. Through conversations at work, I learned that Gabriel had frequented the dealership during my absence, trying to convince Judy to hire him. She refused every time, and eventually, he gave up. Now he regretted not pursuing his ASE certification. His only job option was doing quick oil changes at Valine for $13 an hour. I couldn't help but hope Camila would start working full-time. Otherwise, they'd both struggle. I contacted a realtor and informed Camila that the house was going on the market. Since she had already received the eviction notice, she would need to vacate before the sale was finalized. One evening, she knocked on my door. I hesitated but let her in. She asked if we could talk, but I made it clear I wasn't comfortable. After some convincing, I agreed to meet her at a nearby Denny's. I figured a public setting with witnesses would be safer. Over coffee, she began to open up. When I asked her why she had betrayed me, she hesitated before admitting she had been seeing both Gabriel and me at the same time. She claimed she couldn't choose between us. Her admission was like salt in the wound. She revealed that Gabriel had convinced her to keep their relationship hidden, knowing it would ruin our bond if I ever found out. When I asked why she had said yes to my proposal, her answer left me cold. She said she loved us both, but knew Gabriel wouldn't make a good husband, so she focused on me and our wedding plans. Yet, even on our wedding day, she had been with him. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed, but her emotions didn't move me. She went on to say that after our marriage, she and Gabriel never completely stopped seeing each other. There were quiet periods, but they would meet regularly. She admitted that about a year ago, she had grown resentful toward me because Gabriel had pushed her to explore something involving all three of us. She had considered it, but knew I would never agree. Her resentment grew, and she started blaming me for things I hadn't done. By the end of the conversation, it was clear there was no saving what we once had. I told her as much, emphasizing that any love I once felt had been replaced by contempt. She seemed to finally understand that there would never be an us again. For months later, we finalized the divorce. Gabriel was there as well, standing by her side. As we exited the courthouse, Camila casually suggested grabbing a drink, as if to ease the tension. Surprisingly, I agreed. The bitterness between us had dulled, and I realized I no longer cared about their mess. That day marked the end of my association with both of them. They could have each other now, along with the tangled web they had spun. Camila would need to adjust to a lower standard of living, but that was her problem. As for me, I demanded respect, no matter what others thought of my heritage or anything else.